very fond memories of engagement opportunity. It's one of the most, say, distinct minds that we have in Afghanistan, who is a PhD from Columbia University in anthropology. He's also a medical doctor. In Afghanistan, so I think that's very important because it brings to us, complete life of Afghanistan as a living social space, not just as a geopolitical entity. And I think that is very important because it lends a certain sensitivity in the zones of conflict with living social spaces. That's something very often you tend to lose sight of when we're looking at situations like Afghanistan. So I think that he really brings a very unique perspective. So we look forward to actually celebrating this discussion at a very important point in time, because not only is Afghanistan undergoing very dramatic transformation, it also comes at a time when I think India is very disconnected from what is happening in Afghanistan. Has really lost ground for good reason in Afghanistan, and we have a lot to ponder over this. While we're culturally and geographically close to Afghanistan, India has really lost momentum in Afghanistan. We actually know very little about Afghanistan, despite being so close, so proximate. So I think this is an important conversation for us to have. I'm sure we have to get on. So I'd like to invite Dean Sudarshan, who's also graciously agreed to
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased that the School of Government and Public Policies and the Center for Afghanistan Studies, we have the Dean of the School of International Affairs. So welcome to you. I just wanted to say that I learned about you from a dear friend who lives in Canada now, called Painula Rodriguez. Her husband, Alvaro Rodriguez, worked in the United Nations Development Program, and I was in the same organization. And I've been visiting Afghanistan from March of 2002 till 2012. So that's about 10 years. I made about 2 visits every year to the country. I was really interested in the justice system, and particularly interested in the traditional justice system of the country. And at the time, there were huge arguments between several countries who are supporting. I mean, they basically created fiefdoms out of departments, right? So rural development would be United States, World Bank, justice would be Italy, gender would be Netherlands, and so on. So the ministries and these donors, so it was really a bizarre situation. There were serious arguments, and I was involved in the first Human Development Report, which was produced by University in Kabul. I forget her name now. She was in charge of the policy unit in the university, and we had very, very fine people working on it. And it was on the rule of law, and the cover of that report, had 80% of the cover was pictures of the Shura and Jirga, and the bottom banner was the formal justice system established under the Constitution, signifying that more than 80% of the people go to the traditional institutions and not this one created under the Constitution. And this produced major divisions. Many of these donors said you should ignore the existence of these traditional institutions because they are misogynistic and so on. And so it was generated a lot of debate. But I came away convinced from that experience that all our countries, including India, have to take traditional institutions seriously. Because if you don't, then all the ills that they have will go carry on because we believe that they don't exist. The carpenters, survive because they've been useful to the community, but they do some awful things. So unless we take note of their existence and incorporate them in a constitutional system, you are not going to the bad things they do, and then you're not enabling them to, flourish with doing the good things, mainly property cases and so on. So this was a great learning experience for me, and I think for India we need to think about this. There's been no discussion in this country about our traditional dispute resolution institutions. All the framers of our constitution were barristers at law, and they had a vested interest in the colonial legal system continuing as it is. And so in terms of scholarship and studies, so I think this, so if we learn a little more about Afghanistan, we learn a little more about the vibrancy of these institutions. And so, I'm very grateful that Nainula mentioned that you are now in Delhi and we could connect, and thank you for coming.
I suppose a great comparative. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure. I think it's perhaps my first time talking at Indian and an academic. I have to look at this one, I suppose, right? It's kind of weird to look at this at the same time.
You can look at this one.
It's
You
fine.
can look at
There
that.
you are, you look very handsome.
All right. Anyway, thank you so much for having me. And I don't know much about this tech thing, so at the same time, it's the first time I'm actually talking in an Indian academic institution. So it's the first experience, but at the same time, I believe it's an experience that I'm used to. Because when I think of India, I don't think something that is completely strange or completely different. Because as a student of Afghanistan studies, the student of Central Asia, and studies of the student of Islam, I know that for fact it's impossible to understand Afghanistan without understanding India. It's impossible to read it, it's impossible to have right about it. So, there you go.
I think the mic should be. Yeah, that's right.
If I come close to the mic, then my face is.
I know. You're very good.
Right? Okay. Special. All right. So with that in mind, talking about governance and everything in Afghanistan, I'm actually an anthropologist, so I don't know much about this kind of nuances of how the structural institution people look at, like studies kind of governing governance. But I'm actually more interested in this because it's kind of been part of my life and part of my studies, going through the communist regime, and then after that to the Dragon regime, and after that to the Taliban Emirate, and even more after the the democracy of the Western sort of democracy and stuff. And we all sort of came one after another based growing up in Afghanistan, looking at every experience. And I found something that all of them were familiar, but at the same time, very alien as a person to me. I don't remember what the king system was before that, but then the kind of like revolution slogans of the communist of the UK, and at the same time, revolution slogans of the Mujahideen, and absolutely incomprehensive talks of the Taliban about the American Jihad, and then suddenly you concept as human rights and women's rights and all the things, democracy and things. So I looked and approached all of them. I kind of could connect with that, but at the same time found it's a lot difficult sometimes to digest as something that is kind of relates deeply to me and my family and my neighborhood and my city and stuff. And then that's why the reason I actually sort of like maybe trained as a medical doctor, that's why the reason I actually chose to go through anthropology. So I felt like to somehow I need to understand how Afghanistan works. And this whole question came to me first in 1996 when the first time Taliban came to Kabul. Yes, we went through this like after the horrific civil war between the Mujahideen groups in which Kabul, being one of the most beautiful cities in Central Asia, was somehow reduced to rubble. And the Taliban came in Kabul, and I found that I was actually happy. I thought that's the end of the war, that is the end of the chaos, and here is a government that actually brings with something that's very sacred to us, Islam, a religion, something that's supposed to be based on justice. They're going to bring justice, and they're going to end fitna on chaos. I came out of my house this morning. I went to walk through the Toronto at the center of the city. And there's a nice park there, and there was all the Salvador soldiers standing there. And I started to look at them, and it was very strange. I was looking at them, I started to speak in Farsi, in Persian. They have difficult understanding. I started to speak in Persian because I speak both languages. And they were like somehow kind of getting into it. But their accent was a lot different, but at the same time, they asked a lot of Urdu words in their thing. But at the same time, I didn't understand much about that. But and I looked at the clothing, and then the first thing he asked about was like, why I shave. But the point is that two young people had and that was a question that I was never asked before in my life. And then months passed, weeks passed, weeks turned to months, and I realized that there is something that disconnected between me as a person who never left Afghanistan, grew up in an utterly traditional Muslim family, and had connections with both the city and rural areas. But how on earth I cannot connect and any level with this level of Islam, the way they talk about emirates and a government. And that was kind of a question in a way that's kickballing it. And it took me years actually to realize, and outside witness everything that we were doing, both the Mujahideen and the Taliban, in terms of the construction of the city, but also their ways of how to understand Islam. And more importantly, the Islamic governments. Yeah, Muslims are supposed to be governed by an Islamic system. That was the thing. And it took me a while to kind of figure out that for me, and for a lot of like people, Islam was just a faith. Islam was faith. Something that has a space for culture, some place that my history kind of found meaning in it, the architecture found meaning in it, the poetry found meaning in it. But actually what I'm dealing with was not a faith, but an ideology that's very much similar to the one that in 1979, when the PDK, the communist government, came to Kabul, thought about it in a very kind of the other extreme of it. And I faced with the other thing that actually here, the major question came to me is that where do you stand in this confrontation and this conflict between faith and ideology? And then the 9/11 happened, and for the first time in the history of Afghanistan, we had so many foreigners somehow pouring inside the country. Now, our experience with foreigners are weird. We had the Anglo-Afghan wars, there were like 2,000 British came and went. We had a Soviet war with a few thousand Russians came and went. And the 1960s, we have a lot of heavies, but that was it. We never faced that many internationals coming to Afghanistan with all of their thoughts, ideas, and their kind of plans on how to civilize us, how organize us, and how to bring this democracy. And in that time, to be honest, none of us speak English. I barely spoke a word or two. We didn't know how to talk to them. We didn't know how to understand them. And they didn't know how to talk with us. Absolutely. So there was, but at the same time, with the international community, with the millions and millions of dollars, and with a lot of all this kind of sophisticated looking tools and computers and stuff, and we're sitting there and look like really bewildered at what's going on. At the same time, very happy. It's like, my God, at last some people with like very sophisticated way of thinking came to help us. Not that we need a lot of help, but we need support. But they thought they were helping us. But with them came another group that actually became very pivotal in shaping Afghanistan for 2001 until the fall of Kabul 20 years later. And that was the Afghan diaspora. Suddenly, thousands and thousands and thousands of Afghans who left 30 years ago, they became the intermediary between the international community who came to Afghanistan not knowing where they're going, who this country are. And Afghanistan being not kind of a country that never been sort of directly colonized, that's why it's really hard. It's neither South Asia, nor Central Asia, nor Middle East. It's in the middle. There's all this kind of colonial marking of how the territory, how you divide space and territory. Afghanistan is a blank spot. So for a lot of these experts who came to Afghanistan to study us, not being part of this world, and every part of the world in which they categorize, they have a definition for it. And here they came to a place which doesn't have a definition. So that means a lot of these internationals actually poured on Afghanistan. They all have their own understanding of the space, given their background and expertise either from South Asian or Central Asian or Middle East, or just a blank categorization of the Muslims. So we're going to deal with the Muslims. and stuff. So and we didn't could speak. But with them came many diaspora, and Afghanistan since 2004 and 5 specifically, until its fall of Kabul, became one of the most diaspora-lit country on earth. By the time that President Ghani fled the country, we had around 95% of the top officials who would actually have the power to make decisions with dual citizens. But it started also when in 2006 and stuff, it became dominant in terms of all the connection with the international community, planning, managing, and specifically in executive branch and also development projects. They were always above 60-65%. And because we were not trained, honestly, we didn't know what to do, and we went just out of war. And this is not like something I blame them, but at the same time, this as Dr. Darshan mentioned, this whole idea of like the fiefdoms emerged. And then it took us a long time, maybe after 2014 and 15, in which we thought that the first generation of Afghans trained, thanks to India predominantly, I have to say that a group of us were actually trained in terms of how to manage at least accounting and businesses and stuff. But the major questions remains about how we have to think about Afghanistan and where we are and how to challenge this and what means government for us. Now, with the experience of like this kind of a highly centralized democracy that we can experience the last 20 years, one thing that I think that at least my generation started to look at, like how we have to define Afghanistan, we started to actually say that because of that everything that happens in terms of governance in Afghanistan, it happens in the context of a continuous conflict. And the conflict in which the major purpose of the entire sort of belligerents, specifically Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Pakistanis, was to make the country ungovernable. From the very beginning, starting in 2005. So in the whole idea of the state building and governing happened in that context, and given that given that this confusion already existed, that made the work of governing Afghanistan, even understand, not the work, but the understanding of what governance means in Afghanistan rather difficult. Because everybody thought that the idea of a governance or government started after 2001. And there was nothing before. Because remember I told you all the internationals and all the diaspora came. And Afghanistan diaspora is like very interesting because until 1980, we did not have a single diaspora living abroad, single Afghan. I mean, they were traveling and stuff, but Afghanistan was very few countries was kind of remain isolated. We didn't have any community, and everybody who actually left was during the 80s, and after that they came. So the idea of like how Afghanistan was very contested, and that's sort of like where my generation came in and started to actually for the first time to look at and say how we have to define Afghanistan. That's just started a little bit before 2001. That's something that came to natural started us. And then the question of governance also, in a way, directly linked with the fact that there was an active force to make it ungovernable and create ungovernance. So how we have to imagine both governance and ungovernance at the same time. While one is trying to build, the other one is trying to disrupt. And both sides have they think what they're doing is legitimate, in a sense. With that in mind, we, for the first time, I think maybe after 2015, 16, we started to produce some things that is in English by the Afghan scholars and Afghan students to look and just say, let's think about what governance actually meant for Afghanistan and the forces that actually trying to create ungovernance, if I can use that term. They are not just simply unsophisticated people with very small heads and big beards, but actually we're dealing with a group who are actually acting ideologically, very sophisticated way of creating ungovernance. Now, how we have to understand it. Now, in the context of the ongoing conflict, and like perception of Taliban are like wild people, not just doing this destruction because they're meant to. We started to actually try to first convince internationals about looked at Afghanistan and the concept of state and governance in Afghanistan a little bit further than the 2001 experience, or maybe 1960s experience. And actually we kind of stretched it back to the 1919 when Afghanistan, after the Third Anglo-Afghan War, was the only independent Muslim country on earth. In the 1990s, World War I finished, ended, Ottoman Empire collapsed, Iran was occupied, Central Asia was gone, Emirate of Bukhara collapsed under the things, North Africa was gone, Southeast Asia was gone, and stuff. So Afghanistan kind of remained. And why it's significant, because at the same time, with the fall of the Istanbul to the Allied forces, the main question came as like, where the Khilafat movement, which Ottoman Sultan would say where they have to go. And the Afghan kings and Afghan sort of rulers entertained that idea. People came from different, especially from India at that time, the Khilafat movement, to kind of push for the idea that Afghanistan must become a center of like an Islamic sort of a Khilafat. But in that time, the decision was made that, okay, we want to become a modern state, a modern nation state. Not just a classic monarchy, but a modern nation state. And that, when they imagine it in a way, what I can call the founding fathers of modern Afghanistan, like King Amanullah and all the others, which the guys who study Afghanistan knows, they base it on three principles. This is what we kind of imagine Afghanistan government, in a sense, because we inherited almost nothing institutionally from the colonial powers. When the British came on, there was war, nothing was built. So everything you have to actually imagine it, or just simply look at the other examples in India or Central Asia or Turkey or Europe and try to imagine something. But at least they came up with three principles to actually base the idea of a state and governance of government in Afghanistan in the 1920s. The first one was obviously the constitution. I think Afghanistan is perhaps the first Muslim country. There's a kind of a lot of debate about it. They say of Turkey, but either first or the second who actually adopted the constitution. And the idea of constitution was like, we are Muslims, absolutely no question about it. But the law is applies only to the Muslims in Afghanistan. So the constitution really created like a boundariness, a frontier, a boundary in which kind of defines first modern nation state. The second was, if we are a nation, we are constituted of men and women. So universal education becomes the second pillar of nation state building. You know? That's why the king sent a lot of people to different parts of Europe. And the third was very funny. I mean, to the minds of law, maybe not funny, but interesting. It's archaeology. And they said that if we are a nation, we must have a history beyond, before, and beyond religion. And that's why in 1992, they invited all the French archaeologists and Europeans and others. That's how we suddenly discovered the Buddhist and Hindu and Zoroastrian parts of Afghanistan. Suddenly the whole idea of the Buddhas of Bamyan, specifically the Buddhist heritage of the Kushans and the Hindu heritage of the Hindu Shahis of Kabul and stuff developed. So the three principles become that. And kind of they went all together, though they invited the French first, the archaeologists in 1922 as first. So that became, in a way, the three pillars in which defined Afghanistan for the most of the 20th century. And now look at the Taliban that they came to power. And that system obviously continued from 1980 when the jihad. The interesting part was about religion and education, that the Afghan kings made the rule that anybody goes to study in the religious madrasas of the British India, studying there is punishable by death from 1896 until 1930. Because they thought that the idea they taught there is actually, it's a religion that's based on suppression and confrontation, and we do not want to supplicate. So until 1930, that continued. So the Deobandi Islam was banned, specifically Tajik Tawarikh and Abdullah Khan banned it. By the 1930, the new government thought that's a little bit harsh, but they were like, people can study, but if they go there, they will be not allowed to work on Afghanistan justice or education system. And it continues until 1980, when the jihad against the Soviets began, and millions of Afghans went to Pakistan and stuff, and that's what the introduction of Islam, like a more radical Islam. But now look at the Taliban came. The Taliban came, in a sense, with an idea. Taliban, and I just kind of sometimes put Taliban and Mujahideen, though they are very different, but sometimes they somehow feed each other in terms of continuity. Though they may be different, but Mujahideen, because of the Mujahideen, they have to be Taliban. So genealogically, at least, there's a connection between them. And when the Taliban and Mujahideen came the first time with the question, with the challenge of how we have to kind of imagine this state now. And specifically for Taliban, though Mujahideen sort of started, but the Taliban went very, in a much more open way to destroy all the three principles that actually form the concept of a modern state. We saw the banning of the constitution. They said now it's Sharia law. Women cannot go to school, and destroy pre-Islamic heritage. So it was actually a very thoughtful, in a way, a very kind of a way that is kind of close to more of a jihadist and globalist mentality of like you erase something. But that's how in a way tied with my previous thing is like, even like I cannot see governance very separate from my personal identity. It's like faith versus religion. First versus ideology. That's how this sort of come together. Now, we had now with all the experience of the last 20 years in which Afghanistan fundamentally transformed despite a lot of setbacks and stuff, transformed in terms of infrastructure, transformed in terms of generation, and transformed in terms of thinking. Now it's the first time since 15th century that we have the most urbanization. Now about 25 to 30% of the population either live in the cities, and even another 10%, if you add them, their livelihood directly depends on economic activities in the cities. That's unprecedented in the history of Afghanistan since the Timurid dynasty in the 15th century. And the second thing is also the connectivity. The 20 years of kind of international presence of Afghanistan connected to both physical and visual infrastructure that connect all parts of the country. And the third is also education. And it's the first time we have a critical mass of the Afghans who actually have the opportunity to study. And that's a factor that now when the Taliban came again, these are the things that actually pose huge challenge to them about what means to have a governance right now. Now, where we go from now on. Now, the Taliban are relatively in power. They project an image of being reformed. And the massive charm offensive by Pakistan is to kind of portray them as really nice people with a trimmed beards, not as like wild as used to be, to kind of show them that this is a different thing. But actually, when we look at the Taliban and their conception of the government, some people say it hasn't changed at all. They're the same people. They're going to go and cut heads or hands and stuff. Some people say, no, they are very, very changed. They have learned from the 20 years of war. And now they have a close cooperation with Pakistan, who actually will guide and help them to establish some sort of thing. But I think, at least my experience, and at least the understanding that we have from the Taliban as a phenomenon, is that we're not dealing with a monolithic entity when it comes about how they will grow, how they're going to manage things. We're going to deal with a group that has a very strong ideological, part of it has a very strong ideological commitment to their core roots, which has very little to do with Afghanistan and tied to the global jihadist network. And that is now incarnated through the character of a communist. Now they are the one who controls Kabul, the one who controls the several very important sort of border crossings, and have the most organized groups, kind of militants, and at the same time, powerfully connected with all international sort of Islamist and jihadist organizations, from Al-Qaeda to name it, everybody else. The second group is like the people who are quite sure they might have written some old versions of the Taliban and stuff that kind of try to some portray a semblance of reform, or like an image of like, we are now changing, we want to allow the women to study and stuff. We talk to the media, talk to the Americans, and speak a little bit of English. We see these two elements. And if one thing we have learned from the experience, our experience with jihadism, with Mujahideen, or with the jihadi groups, and the experience in Iraq and Syria and Middle East in general, is the biggest challenge for this kind of ideological jihadist groups is the transition from being a militant group into a political entity. Our experience with Mujahideen groups, which were, I think, the first of its kind in the world history, has been that as soon as they try to do a transition, they simply kind of collapsed into small ethnic or sectarian groups. And they then went to fighting each other, and they lost the core of their supporters, and actually the kind of the ideological charm that they used to kind of, or interest that they used to kind of gather the people. We saw the same thing happen at Al-Jabhat al-Nusra. We saw the same thing happen in Iraq and in Syria and stuff. But and the same question now, it remains with the Taliban. My understanding is when you think about now governance in Afghanistan, it is impossible to kind of separate it from the understanding of the nature of Talibanism, jihadism and stuff. This is now both forces actually in confrontation with each other. But one fact that they never experienced before, and now is kind of seen not very much in kind of people not pay a lot of attention to it, is the transformation to that on society, both as a man and woman, and as educated, as an urban and rural, have witnessed in the last 20 years. That somehow the Taliban now have to not deal with the women who just are female, but actually with a woman who actually understands what it means to be educated, what it means to have a voice, what it means to have a right. The Taliban has to deal with that service delivery. Last 20 years, the government in Afghanistan, despite a lot of shortcomings, managed to provide a lot of sort of basic services to the population. And now that is not, and even because of the Pakistanis are now doing their best to convince the world, and the Taliban are actually trying to scare the Europeans that if you don't fund us, we're going to leave, send all the refugees, but if you fund us, we're not going to send anybody to get funding for the Taliban. But the mentality of the Taliban is and the way they explain that actually make the idea of the service delivery, they make them very difficult for them to do that because they neither have the expertise nor, more importantly, the mindset. Because the Talibanism and jihadism is the way we experienced it before, and the jihadism, the way it functioned in the Middle East and South Asia and Central Asia. It's not about governing, it's about ruling. And that's the two things that in which when you think about Afghanistan, actually put it in the context of these groups. That is, I think that we have to. And so even people say we put money into them and they might change. My understanding is like more resources, if the game done without thinking, without like clear understanding of them, simply will lead to the consolidation of the regime rather than actually providing services for the population. That because that is, if nothing is in a very simplistic way, that is the nature of authoritarian regimes. The more fun for them come, the more consolidated. So now we're in a situation by now that there are a lot more questions and answers, and I'm not a prophet, kind of, I don't see myself as a prophet to say a lot what might happen, but actually what I see is Taliban and Pakistanis are trying their best to kind of project to the world an image of efficiency, an image of like a compromise and reform, but in the core, but at the same time, there's been limited access to them. And I believe that dealing, especially with the Taliban and Pakistan, is dealing with the Trump administration. Now we are experts in the art of the deal. So with that in mind, I think this is some way to get more resources rather than providing and like kind of providing any services. We're not further support for the Taliban or anything or recognition. That means that actually a consolidation of a regime that actually fundamentally in conflict with the roots of what constitutes an Afghan society and Afghan history. People try to portray them in the light of ethnic sort of things and sectarian things. Ethnic and sectarian things always exist in Afghanistan, but at the same time, Afghanistan is the only country from Bengal to Balkan that never had a secessionist movement in the course of its history. So, and it doesn't mean that all these ethnic groups loved each other. They did not. It was like, pardon my language, I love you, love me, let's not go to bed, kind of situation for most of them. But the point is they never experienced such sort of social movement. So ethnicity is an important factor in governance. All these things factor, but at the same time, we're dealing with an alien concept in which a religion is transformed by ideology. It managed to mobilize a certain group of population, but at the end of the day, the survivability of a regime or a government depends on how it governs. And I do not see the Taliban or Talibanism as a factor that actually provides governance, except for it. So for the rest, I think we can go for Q&A. I think I hope I didn't overstep my time. Thank you very much.
That gives us a lot to talk about. Before we break into the discussion, I'd like to thank our guests who joined us virtually on Zoom and YouTube. We now open the floor for discussion for our audience who are attending the talk in person. Thank you very much.
The screen's finished. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Oh, that's all right. That's fine. I was just tired of looking at myself, so I thought let's